The wind came down from the Altiplano like a blade, carrying dust and the smell of tin smoke from the smelters west of Potosi. It was 1952, and Bolivia had just nationalized the mines, but here in the forgotten village of Chusquipampa, nothing had changed except the flags. The same men worked the same shafts, the same widows sold chicha from clay pots, the same dogs fought over scraps behind the company store. Mateo Quispe was 23 years old, lean as a mining timber, with hands already scarred from rock and rope. He had worked the cooperative shaft since he was 15, following his father into the dark until his father didn't come out. Now Mateo lived in a rented room above the cantina, saving every peso he could scrape from his wages. When old Saturnino died without heirs, the village held an auction for his property, a sagging stone hut on the eastern slope, half buried in scree, with a roof of rotted thatch and walls that leaned like drunks. The land was worthless, too steep for crops, too far from water, too close to the old colonial workings that had been abandoned for a century. 5 pesos, Mateo said, standing in the plaza with his hat in his hands. The other men laughed. Rigoberto Cruz, who ran the village store and fancied himself a landowner, spat into the dust. "You're buying a tomb, boy. Saturnino went mad up there talking to ghosts. You'll do the same." 10 pesos, said Father Eugenio, the priest, but only out of pity. He didn't want the land either. Mateo held firm. 15. The auctioneer, a mestizo clerk from the municipal office, looked around for other bids. There were none. Sold to the young fool for 15 pesos. Rigoberto leaned close as Mateo counted out his coins. "You just bought your grave, Quispe. That land is cursed. The Spaniards bled it dry 300 years ago." Mateo said nothing. He took the deed, a single yellowed page with a wax seal, and walked east, up the switchback trail toward his new property. The hut sat where the village ended and the wilderness began, perched on a shelf of volcanic rock overlooking the valley. The door hung on leather hinges. Inside, there was a dirt floor, a broken table, a hearth blackened with old fires. Saturnino's belongings were still there, a wool blanket stiff with mold, a tin cup, a wooden cross on the wall. Mateo swept the floor with a bundle of ichu grass and set his bedroll in the corner. Through the empty window frame, he could see the lights of Chusquipampa below, small as fireflies. Beyond them, the mountains rose in layers of shadow, blue, then purple, then black against the stars. He lit a candle and sat at the table, spreading the deed before him. The Spanish was old and formal, full of terms he didn't understand. But one phrase caught his eye. "Incluyendo todas las vetas y labores subterráneas no reclamadas por la corona," including all veins and underground workings not claimed by the crown. Mateo frowned. He knew the Spanish had worked this mountain. Everyone knew. They had carved tunnels like wormholes, following silver veins until the ore ran out or the shafts flooded. But not claimed by the crown. What did that mean? He slept poorly that first night. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and twice he woke to the sound of stones shifting outside, as if something were moving on the slope. In the morning he walked the property. It was larger than he'd thought, nearly 2 hectares of steep, rocky ground covered in scrub and scree. At the western edge, where the land dropped sharply into a ravine, he found the entrance to an old adit, a horizontal mine tunnel half collapsed, its mouth choked with rubble and thornbush. He knelt and peered inside. The darkness was absolute. Cold air breathed out, smelling of stone and water. That evening he went down to the village for supplies. At the store, Rigoberto smirked from behind the counter. "How's your palace, Quispe? Sleep well with the ghosts." "I need a lamp oil and a pick," Mateo said, placing his coins on the wood. Rigoberto counted them slowly. "Planning to dig, are you? Looking for the treasure old Saturnino babbled about before he died?" He laughed, and the other men in the store laughed with him. "My grandfather worked those tunnels when he was a boy. They're empty. The Spaniards took everything worth taking." Mateo took his purchases and left without answering. For 3 days, he cleared the entrance to the adit, hauling away stones and cutting back the brush. The work was hard and his hands bled, but he had spent his life underground. He knew rock. He knew the feel of solid ground and the smell of bad air. On the 4th day, he crawled inside with his lamp. The tunnel ran straight into the mountain, shored up with ancient timbers that were black with age and damp. The walls were hand-carved, rough and irregular, following the natural fractures in the rock. After 20 meters, the passage widened into a small chamber where the miners had worked a vein. The walls were scratched with chisel marks, and the floor was littered with broken pottery and rusted tools, remnants of colonial labor. But the vein was gone, mined out, just as Rigoberto had said. Matteo sat on a rock and drank from his canteen, the lamp flickering beside him. He was about to turn back when he noticed something odd. The chamber had 3 passages leading out. 2 were collapsed, filled with rubble. But the third to the left was different. It wasn't blocked, it was hidden. Someone had stacked stones across the entrance to make it look like a collapse, but the stones were loose, carefully placed, not fallen. Matteo pulled them away one by one, and cold air rushed past him, carrying a scent like metal and earth. Behind the false wall was another passage, narrower than the first, descending steeply into the mountain. Matteo's heart beat faster. He held the lamp forward and saw tool marks on the walls, fresh compared to the others, made with Spanish chisels but never finished. The passage ended after 15 meters in a solid face of rock, but the rock was wrong. It was grey limestone, not the volcanic basalt of the surrounding mountain, and running through it, like black lightning, was a narrow vein of ore, dull, heavy, shot through with pockets of crystal that caught the lamplight and threw it back in silver fire. Matteo touched the vein with trembling fingers. He broke off a piece and held it to the light. The ore was rich, far richer than anything he'd seen in the cooperative mines. Silver sulfide, mixed with native silver, the kind the Spaniards would have killed for. He sat back against the wall, breathing hard. Someone had found this vein and sealed it, hidden it, never reported it to the colonial authorities, and now it was his. Chapter 2. The Whispers. Matteo told no one. For 2 weeks, he worked the tunnel in secret, descending each morning before dawn and returning after dark, his clothes grey with dust, his face lean with exhaustion. He widened the passage, shored up the roof with timber he cut from the ravine, and began to sample the vein. Every piece he chipped away confirmed what he already knew. The ore was exceptional, possibly the richest silver deposit left in the region, but he needed proof. He needed assay results, and for that, he needed to go into town. He wrapped a dozen samples in cloth and carried them down to Chusquipampa on a Saturday, when the assayer from Potosi made his weekly visit. The man was a Spaniard named Esteban, old and sharp-eyed, who set up his scales and acids in the back room of the cantina. Matteo waited his turn, standing in the corner while miners and speculators brought their samples forward. When his name was called, he unwrapped the ore and placed it on the table. Esteban picked up a piece, turning it in the light. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened. "Where did you get this?" "My land," Matteo said. "East Slope." "The old Saturnino place?" "Yes." Esteban tested the ore with acid, watching the reaction, then weighed it carefully on his scale. He wrote numbers in his ledger, his hand steady, but when he looked up, his eyes were different, hungry. "This is high grade," he said quietly. 70% silver, maybe more. "Where exactly did you find it?" "On my property," Matteo repeated. "In an old working. I'll need to see the site to verify." "No," Matteo said. "Just give me the assay." Esteban smiled thinly. "I'm required to report significant discoveries to the mining authority in Potosi. It's the law." Matteo felt ice in his chest. "The land is mine. I have the deed." "Of course," Esteban said smoothly. "But mineral rights are a complicated matter, especially for colonial workings. The government may have a claim, or the cooperative. We should consult with the authorities for your protection." Matteo took the samples and the assay paper and left without another word. By Monday, everyone in Chusquipampa knew. Rigoberto stopped him outside the store, his face flushed with excitement and resentment. "So it's true? You found silver up there?" "I found a vein," Matteo said carefully. "Esteban says it's the richest ore he's seen in 20 years. Says you could be sitting on a fortune." Rigoberto's voice dropped. "Says the government might take it. Says old colonial mines belong to the state now, not to whoever buys the land. The deed says, the deed is 300 years old, boy, Spanish law. Bolivia doesn't recognize Spanish grants anymore. Not since the revolution. Rigoberto stepped closer. You should sell. I'll give you 500 pesos for the land. Right now. Cash. Mateo stared at him. You said it was worthless. I was wrong. Rigoberto spread his hands. Everyone's wrong sometimes. 500 is a fair price, more than fair. No. Rigoberto's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Quispe. Men with money and connections are going to come for that silver. You're just a miner. You don't have lawyers or friends in the capital. You'll lose everything. Mateo walked away. That night someone threw stones at his hut, shattering the window frame. In the morning, he found the trail to his property blocked with thorn bush, deliberately piled to slow him down. He cleared it and kept working. He reinforced the tunnel entrance with a wooden door and an iron lock he bought in Potosi. He moved his samples and tools deeper into the mountain, hiding them in side passages, and he began to read everything he could find about Bolivian mining law, colonial grants, and mineral rights. The law was a maze. The 1952 revolution had nationalized the tin mines, but silver fell into a gray area. Small deposits could be claimed by individuals or cooperatives, but large deposits required government approval. And colonial workings, mines that had been worked during Spanish rule, were subject to special review. Mateo's heart sank. If the government decided his vein was a colonial deposit, they could seize it. Compensate him with a fraction of its value, if anything. He needed proof that the vein had never been claimed, that the Spaniards had never reported it. He returned to the tunnel and searched the sealed chamber more carefully. In a crevice near the false wall, he found something wrapped in oiled leather, a bundle of papers, brittle with age, covered in spidery Spanish script. He brought them into the light and read. They were letters, dated 1780, written by a colonial engineer named Diego de Oropesa to his brother in Lima. The letters described a secret vein discovered by Indian laborers in the lower workings of Chusquipampa. Their vein so rich it would have made the finder wealthy beyond measure. But de Oropesa had not reported it to the crown. Instead, he had sealed the tunnel, murdered the laborers who found it, and planned to return after his contract ended to mine it privately. But he never returned. The final letter mentioned illness, debts, and threats from the colonial governor. The last line was unfinished. If I do not survive, let this record stand as testimony. Mateo sat in the darkness, the letters trembling in his hands. This was his proof. The vein had never been claimed by Spain. It had been deliberately hidden, a crime against the crown, lost to history. It belonged to no one. Until now. Chapter 3. The Siege. The men came on a Thursday. Mateo was working deep in the tunnel when he heard voices outside, loud, confident, speaking Spanish with the clipped accent of La Paz. He climbed out to find 3 men standing by his hut. One was Esteban, the assayer. The other 2 were strangers, a fat man in a grey suit and a younger man with a surveyor's transit. Senor Quispe, the fat man said, smiling. My name is Vargas. I represent a mining consortium in the capital. We've heard about your discovery. Mateo said nothing. Vargas gestured toward the tunnel. We'd like to inspect the site. Purely professional interest. If the deposit is as significant as Esteban suggests, we're prepared to make you a very generous offer. The land is not for sale, Mateo said. Vargas's smile didn't waver. I understand your attachment, but mining is expensive, Senor Quispe. You'll need equipment, labor, permits, legal representation. We can provide all of that, in exchange for a share of the profits. No. The smile faded. You're being unreasonable. The government will review your claim. When they do, they'll find that colonial workings are subject to state oversight. You could lose everything. We're offering you a partnership. Get off my land, Mateo said. Vargas studied him for a long moment, then nodded to the younger man. Make note of the location. We'll file a petition with the mining authority. They left, but Mateo knew they'd be back. That night, he moved the letters to a new hiding place, a crevice high in the tunnel roof, wrapped in canvas and sealed with wax. He couldn't risk them being found or stolen. The next day, Father Eugenio climbed the trail to see him. The old priest was breathing hard, leaning on a walking stick, his cassock dusty from the climb. "Matteo," he said gently, "I've known you since you were a boy. I baptized you, I buried your father, so I'm going to speak plainly." Matteo offered him water. The priest drank, then continued. "There are powerful men who want that silver. Men with lawyers and judges in their pockets. They will destroy you if you fight them." He paused. "Sell the land. Take the money. Start a new life somewhere else." "This is my home," Matteo said. "This is a death sentence." Father Eugenio's voice cracked. "I've seen it before. In the old days, when the tin barons ruled, men who found something valuable didn't live long. Things have changed, but not that much. Greed is still greed." "I have proof," Matteo said quietly, "proof that the vein was never claimed, that it belongs to whoever owns the land." The priest's eyes widened. "What kind of proof?" Matteo hesitated, then told him about the letters. Father Eugenio sat down heavily on a rock. "Colonial documents, written by a Spanish engineer." He shook his head slowly. "Matteo, those letters are evidence of a crime, murder, fraud, theft from the crown. They prove the vein exists, but they also prove it was hidden illegally. A judge could rule either way." "Then I'll take them to the mining authority myself," Matteo said. "Let them decide. The mining authority answers to politicians. Politicians answer to money." The priest stood, gripping his stick. "I will pray for you, Matteo, but I fear prayer won't be enough." The following week, the pressure increased. Rigoberto refused to sell him supplies. The cantina owner, who had always been friendly, turned cold. Miners he'd worked with for years crossed the street to avoid him. And then the threats began. Someone left a dead dog on his doorstep, its throat cut. Someone set fire to the thorn bush near his tunnel entrance in the middle of the night. Matteo woke to the smell of smoke and ran out to beat the flames down with a blanket. On Saturday, a lawyer from Potosi arrived with papers from the mining authority, a formal notice of inquiry into Matteo's claim. He had 30 days to provide documentation, submit to inspection, and prove his legal right to extract ore from colonial workings. Matteo read the notice 3 times. The language was dense, full of legal terms he didn't understand. But the message was clear. If he didn't comply, the government would seize the land pending investigation. He walked down to Chusquipampa and asked to use the telegraph at the municipal office. He sent a message to the only lawyer he knew, a distant cousin in Oruro who had helped his mother with a land dispute years ago. The reply came 2 days later. "Cannot help. Case too complex. Recommend you settle." Matteo crumpled the telegram and threw it into the fire. That night he sat in the tunnel with his lamp staring at the vein. The silver gleamed in the light, beautiful and cold, worth more than he could earn in 10 lifetimes. But it might as well have been a curse. He thought about giving up, about selling to Vargas, taking the money, and disappearing. But then he thought about his father, crushed in a cooperative shaft because the company hadn't bothered to shore up the roof. He thought about the widows selling chicha, about the children with crooked backs from carrying ore, about the men who worked themselves to death so that men like Vargas could grow fat. This silver was his. He had bought the land. He had found the vein. He had the proof. And he would fight. He climbed out of the tunnel and walked down to the village, straight to the cantina. The room went quiet when he entered. Rigoberto and Vargas were sitting at a table in the corner, drinking pisco and laughing. Matteo walked up to them and dropped the assay report on the table. "I'm filing a formal claim with the mining authority," he said loudly so everyone could hear. "And I'm requesting a public hearing. I have evidence that the vein was never claimed by Spain, that it belongs to me under Bolivian law." Vargas looked at him with cold amusement. "Evidence? What evidence?" "Colonial letters, written by the engineer who sealed the tunnel, proof that the vein was hidden from the crown." The room erupted in whispers. Vargas's smile vanished. "If you have such documents," he said slowly, "you're required to surrender them to the authorities immediately. Colonial records are state property." "They're on my land," Matteo said. "Found in my tunnel, they're mine." Vargas stood. "You're making a very serious mistake, boy." "Then I'll make it in public," Matteo said. in front of a judge. He turned and walked out. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later in Potosi, at the Regional Mining Authority headquarters. Mateo spent every day preparing, copying passages from the letters, organizing his documents and rehearsing his argument. He had no lawyer, no experience with the law, but he had the truth. On the morning of the hearing, he dressed in his only suit, his father's dark wool, smelling of camphor, and walked the 12 kilometers to the main road where he caught a truck to the city. Potosi was a maze of colonial streets and Republican buildings, crowned by the red mountain of Cerro Rico, which had bled silver into Spanish coffers for 3 centuries. The Mining Authority office was a stone building near the plaza, with iron bars on the windows and a flag hanging limp in the thin air. Mateo climbed the steps and entered. The hearing room was small and airless, with a long table at the front where 3 officials sat, a judge, a mining engineer, and a representative from the Ministry of Resources. To the side, Vargas sat with 2 lawyers, their briefcases open, papers spread before them like weapons. Mateo sat alone on a wooden bench. The judge, a mestizo man with grey hair and tired eyes, called the session to order. This is an inquiry into the mineral claim filed by Mateo Quispe for property located in Chusquipampa, Department of Potosi. Senor Quispe, you claim ownership of a silver vein discovered in colonial workings. The consortium represented by Senor Vargas disputes your claim, arguing that colonial deposits are subject to state oversight. Present your evidence. Mateo stood. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. Your Honor, I own the land legally. I have the deed issued during the colonial period, which includes all underground workings not claimed by the Spanish crown. He placed the deed on the table. I found a sealed tunnel on my property. Inside, I discovered a rich silver vein and these letters. He unwrapped the letters carefully and laid them out. The paper was brown with age. The ink faded but still legible. The judge leaned forward, studying them. These are colonial documents. Where exactly did you find them? In the sealed tunnel, hidden in a crevice. The judge picked up one of the letters and read aloud. I have concealed the entrance to prevent discovery by the Crown's agents. The vein is richer than any in Cerro Rico. I will return when it is safe. The room was silent. Vargas's lawyer stood. Your Honor, these letters are evidence of a crime. Concealment of Crown property, murder of indigenous workers, fraud. Under colonial law, any ore discovered in the King's domain belonged to the Crown, regardless of who found it. The vein described in these letters was Spanish property. It therefore passes to the Bolivian state as successor to Spanish sovereignty. Mateo felt his stomach drop. The judge looked at him. How do you respond? Mateo took a breath. The letters prove the vein was never reported to the Crown. It was hidden deliberately. A crime, yes, but a crime that voided any Spanish claim. The engineer who wrote these letters was planning to steal from the king. He failed. The vein remained hidden for over 170 years. It was lost to history. Bolivia inherited Spanish claims, but you can't inherit something Spain never knew existed. The lawyer smirked. Interesting logic, but legally baseless. The Spanish crown owned all mineral deposits in the viceroyalty, whether reported or not. Then why? Mateo said, his voice rising. Does my deed specifically mention veins and workings not claimed by the crown? The Spanish knew there were hidden deposits. That's why they added that language. They couldn't claim what they didn't know about, and my deed transfers those rights to me. The judge frowned, flipping through the deed again. The mining engineer, who had been silent until now, spoke up. If the vein was never worked, never recorded, never taxed, it's not technically a colonial deposit. It's a new discovery on private land. Vargas's lawyer shook his head. It's in a colonial tunnel. That makes it colonial. The tunnel was sealed, Mateo said. Sealed by a Spanish criminal who had no authority. The only reason the vein survived is because no one reported it. If Spain had known, they would have seized it and worked it out. But they didn't. So it doesn't belong to Spain's successor, it belongs to the landowner. The judge rubbed his temples. This is unprecedented. I need to consult with the ministry's legal division. He looked at Mateo. Do you have the letters authenticated? Verified by a historian? Matteo's heart sank. No, Your Honor. I only found them 3 weeks ago. Then we cannot accept them as evidence until they're verified. This hearing is adjourned pending expert review. Vargas was smiling again. Matteo stood frozen as the officials gathered their papers and left. The hearing had lasted less than an hour. He had told the truth, presented his proof, and it wasn't enough. Outside, on the steps, Father Eugenio was waiting. The old priest had traveled to Potosi without telling Matteo, sitting in the back of the hearing room. "I'm sorry, my son," he said quietly. Matteo couldn't speak. He sat down on the stone steps and stared at the mountain. "There is one more thing you can do," Father Eugenio said. "The university in Sucre has an archive of colonial documents. If you can get a historian to verify the letters, to testify that they're genuine—" "That will take months," Matteo said. "I don't have months. Vargas will bribe someone, or the government will seize the land before I can prove anything." "Then you must go now, today. I have a friend at the university. I'll write you a letter of introduction." Matteo looked at him. "Why are you helping me?" The priest smiled sadly. "Because I'm tired of seeing the powerful take from the powerless. Because your father was a good man who died for scraps. Because you bought that land honestly, and you deserve what you found." 3 days later, Matteo was in Sucre, standing in the marble halls of the Universidad Mayor de San Francisco Xavier, holding a letter from Father Eugenio and a bundle of fragile documents that might be his salvation or his ruin. The historian, Dr. Carmen Arce, was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and ink-stained fingers. She examined the letters for 2 hours, using magnifying glasses and reference books, comparing handwriting and paper quality with known colonial samples. Finally, she looked up. "These are genuine," she said. "Written by Diego de Oropesa, a mining engineer employed by the Viceroyalty between 1778 and 1781. His signature matches records in the Lima archive. The paper is consistent with the period. The content—" She paused. "The content is extraordinary. This is evidence of a concealed deposit, a crime under colonial law, as your opponents will argue. But it's also evidence that the Crown never claimed the vein. Legally, that creates ambiguity." "Will you testify?" Matteo asked. "I will." The second hearing was held 4 weeks later. This time the room was crowded. Miners from Chusquipampa, journalists from La Paz, a representative from the National Mining Union. Vargas sat with his lawyers, but he looked less confident. Dr. Arce took the stand and authenticated the letters. She explained their historical context, the legal implications, and the significance of the phrase, "not claimed by the Crown." "In colonial law," she said, "the king owned all subsoil rights, but he could only claim what he knew about. Hidden deposits like smuggled ore or concealed veins existed outside the legal framework. They were stolen property, yes, but stolen from a regime that no longer exists. Bolivia inherited Spanish claims, but only legitimate claims. This vein was never legitimate under Spanish law. It was a secret. Therefore, it cannot be considered a colonial asset." The judge listened carefully. So did the mining engineer and the ministry representative. Vargas's lawyer tried to argue, but his words sounded hollow now. After 2 hours of testimony and debate, the judge called for a recess. When he returned, his face was grave. "This is a complex case, but the evidence suggests that the vein discovered by Senor Quispe was deliberately concealed from colonial authorities and never claimed by the Spanish crown. Under the doctrine of terra nullius as applied to mineral rights, unclaimed deposits on private land belong to the landowner. The claim of Matteo Quispe is recognized." The room erupted. Matteo sat very still, not quite believing it. Vargas stood and stormed out, his lawyers scrambling behind him. Dr. Arce smiled from across the room. Father Eugenio, sitting in the back, bowed his head and prayed. 6 months later, Matteo stood at the entrance to his tunnel, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Below, in Chusquipampa, a new stone school was under construction, paid for with silver. The village well had been deepened. The cantina had a new roof. He had hired 20 men from the village to work the vein. Proper wages, proper equipment, proper safety. No one would die in his mine the way his father had died. The silver was rich, richer than anyone had imagined. Enough to change lives. Enough to prove that truth, when defended with courage, could defeat greed. Mateo touched the rough stone of the tunnel entrance and thought of Diego de Oropesa, the Spanish engineer who had tried to steal a mountain and failed. The mountain had kept its secret for 170 years. Now it belonged to the boy who had bought a worthless hut and refused to let go.